Guys, like, comment, subscribe, share the video, especially if you love MMA as much as I do. Speaking of MMA, I have a very spicy potential fight that could have happened, but never happened. This could have happened during Pride. Chuck Liddell versus Dan Henderson. As we all know, they're both MMA legends, both Hall of Famers, both respected in the MMA community, both accomplished fighters, dangerous fighters, knockout artists, actually. Let's look at Chuck Liddell first. Chuck Liddell's a former UFC light heavyweight champion, defended the belt 4 times before getting knocked out by Rampage Jackson, getting beat by him again. Up until then, he was dangerous. He knocked out Randy Couture twice, Tito Ortiz twice. He's knocked out Kevin Randleman. He's knocked out Guy Mesger. Respectable legends in the MMA world. Shout out to Kevin Randleman. Rest in peace, by the way. But let's look at Dan Henderson on the other side. He never won a UFC championship belt, but he did have 3 world title belts from Pride. The Pride welterweight Grand Prix and the welterweight title belt itself in 05 or 06, whenever it was. And then he won the Pride middleweight title by knocking out Vanderlei Silva in a rematch that they had where Vanderlei beat him before by decision. He also won the Strikeforce light heavyweight championship. He's also knocked out a lot of guys, most notably Fedor Emelianenko, who I'm going to talk about very soon. Stylistically, Chuck Liddell was primarily a striker, but he could wrestle. He actually was good at defending takedowns. That's part of why he beat Tito Ortiz in the first 2 fights that they had when they were both in their prime. He was able to force his takedown defense was so good and so hard to deal with. It forced Tito Ortiz to stand, and that's where it led to his demise. He would have to stand with Chuck, and that's why he'd lose. Competitive fights, but the ability to stuff takedowns and keep the fight standing really helped him. And Chuck was just an aggressive guy. He's just very dangerous on the feet, but he's also a smart striker too. He's not so much of a brawler like Vanderlei. Vanderlei would have hit you from anywhere and probably knock you out or win a decision over you, or sometimes he'll get outsmarted and he'd lose. But still a dangerous guy. That's why Chuck beat him. Dan Henderson can brawl. He's willing to brawl. But what's good about him is he also is very calculated with that big right hand. He'd knock you out with it and put you away with it in the right spot. He's knocked out a lot of guys like that. He can also wrestle himself. I think he has a gold medal or a silver medal, something like that, right? He's a very good wrestler. So Chuck's good at takedown defense, but I don't think he's quite good enough to stop Dan Henderson from eventually taking him down, because I do think Dan Henderson can hang with Chuck Liddell, and that's before Chuck got knocked out a lot later in his career when he was pretty much done. I'm talking about when these guys were in their prime, when they both looked unstoppable. Dan Henderson could have beat Chuck Liddell. I think he would have beat Chuck Liddell. Even if they had to stand, I don't think, here's the thing, Dan Henderson was never knocked out in his prime. You know, he was never really stopped. He got beat by decision. You know what I mean? He would get outstruck. But the problem is, when you're fighting a guy that can strike and you know how to wrestle better, I think his ability to take Chuck Liddell down versus Chuck trying to stop the takedowns would be a little bit better. I don't think he would have ragdolled Chuck Liddell with his wrestling. If this was a 3 or 5 round fight, he probably would have took him down 2, maybe 3 times tops. I do think Chuck Liddell would give him a fit with his wrestling defense, but it wouldn't be good enough to shut down the wrestling to where Dan Henderson's forced to stand with him the whole time. And even if Dan had to stand with him, I do think he probably would have knocked out Chuck Liddell. Maybe he could have. I don't know. If he didn't knock out Chuck Liddell, he would have rocked him and then hit him again and again and dropped him and followed up with some strikes and then put him away. So I got Dan Henderson beating Chuck Liddell if they were both in their prime. I think Dan Henderson would have put it away. He would have if he didn't knock out Chuck Liddell, he would have done what Keith Jardine did, dropped him a time or 2 and really rocked his world and just controlled it with the wrestling. So most likely a decision over Chuck Liddell, but it wouldn't surprise me if he knocked out Chuck Liddell. Chuck Liddell could have knocked out Dan Henderson, but let's keep in mind, Dan Henderson didn't really get finished until later in his career like Chuck did. But I do think Dan Henderson had more ways to win the fight than Chuck Liddell did. So that's just my opinion.